Picture this, it's the year 793 AD, and you're a monk living peacefully on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of England. You're going about your daily prayers when suddenly, out of nowhere, dragon-headed ships appear on the horizon. Within hours, your monastery is burning, your treasures are gone, and your fellow monks are either dead or enslaved. This wasn't just a random raid, this was the beginning of something that would completely reshape the map of Europe forever. What you just witnessed was the dawn of the Viking Age, and over the next 3 centuries, these Norse warriors wouldn't just be content with hit-and-run attacks. They would carve out kingdoms, establish trade routes spanning continents, and literally redraw the political boundaries of Europe in ways that still echo today. But here's what most people don't realise about the Vikings. They weren't just bloodthirsty raiders. They were master strategists, brilliant navigators, and perhaps most importantly, they were empire builders on a scale that would make even the Romans jealous. Now you might think you know the Viking story. Maybe you've seen the TV shows or read about their legendary brutality. But what I'm about to show you goes far deeper than axes and longships. We're talking about how a relatively small population from Scandinavia managed to establish kingdoms from Iceland to Russia, from Ireland to Constantinople. We're talking about how they didn't just conquer territory, they fundamentally changed the DNA of European civilization itself. And here's the thing that blew my mind when I started researching this. The Vikings didn't just stumble into success. They had a systematic approach to expansion that was centuries ahead of its time. They combined military might with diplomatic cunning, trade networks with territorial conquest, and cultural adaptation with political innovation. By the time we're done, you'll understand how these so-called barbarians from the north became the puppet masters pulling the strings of medieval Europe. But to really grasp the magnitude of what the Vikings accomplished, we need to understand where they came from and why they exploded onto the European scene when they did. Because this wasn't just about wanting to raid and pillage. There were deeper forces at work that turned Scandinavia into a launching pad for one of history's most dramatic expansions. The story begins in the harsh landscapes of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark during the 8th century. Now imagine trying to scrape out a living in these unforgiving northern territories. You've got long, brutal winters, limited farmland, and a growing population that's starting to outstrip the resources available. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of just accepting their fate, the Scandinavians developed something that would give them a massive advantage over everyone else: superior maritime technology. These weren't just boats we're talking about. These were revolutionary vessels that could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. The Viking longship was like having a Swiss army knife of naval warfare. It could carry up to 60 warriors, travel at speeds that left contemporary ships in the dust, and most crucially, it had a shallow draft that meant Vikings could sail right up rivers and launch surprise attacks deep inland. While other European powers were stuck thinking defensively about their coastlines, the Vikings had basically invented amphibious warfare. But technology alone doesn't explain the Viking explosion. There was something else happening in Scandinavian society that created the perfect storm for expansion. See, these weren't centralized kingdoms like you'd find elsewhere in Europe. Instead, you had a collection of competing chieftains and jarls, each trying to outdo the others in wealth, prestige, and power. This created an incredibly competitive culture where young warriors had to prove themselves through daring raids and conquests. And then there's the factor that most historians underestimate: climate change. Yeah, you heard that right. The medieval warm period, roughly from 950 to 1250 AD, made northern waters more navigable and opened up new possibilities for long-distance voyages. Suddenly, routes that had been too dangerous or impossible became viable, and the Vikings were perfectly positioned to take advantage. Now, here's where the story gets really fascinating. The first major Viking raids weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully planned reconnaissance missions. When those dragon ships hit Lindisfarne in 793, the Vikings weren't just grabbing treasure and running. They were gathering intelligence about defences, wealth distribution, and political structures across Europe. They were basically conducting market research for invasion, and what they discovered was that Europe was ripe for the taking. The Carolingian Empire was starting to fracture. England was divided into competing kingdoms that spent more time fighting each other than watching their coastlines. Ireland was a patchwork of clan territories with virtually no coordinated defence. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire was focused on threats from the east and south, leaving their northern approaches virtually unguarded. The Vikings looked at this landscape and saw opportunity everywhere. But here's what separated them from other raiders throughout history. They didn't just hit and run. They developed a three-pronged strategy that would prove devastatingly effective: raid, settle, and integrate. First, they'd launch lightning raids to test defences and gather wealth. These weren't mindless attacks. They were surgical strikes designed to maximise profit while minimising risk. Vikings would target monasteries not just because they were undefended, but because they were essentially medieval banks, storing the accumulated wealth of entire regions. But then came Phase 2, and this is where the Vikings showed their true genius. Instead of just taking their loot and going home, they started establishing permanent bases. They'd find strategic locations, river mouths, islands, fortified hills, and build what they called long forts. These weren't just military camps, they were the seeds of future cities and kingdoms. Phase 3 was the masterstroke: integration. The Vikings didn't try to impose Scandinavian culture everywhere they went. Instead, they adapted to local customs, while maintaining their military and technological advantages. In Ireland, they became Irish Vikings. In France, they became Norman French. In Russia, they became the founders of the very state that would one day become the Russian Empire. This flexibility was revolutionary. While other conquerors throughout history had either been absorbed by the cultures they conquered or had tried to completely replace local traditions, the Vikings found a middle path that allowed them to maintain power while building sustainable kingdoms. Take what happened in England, for instance. When the Great Heathen Army landed in 865, they weren't just coming to raid, they were coming to stay. Led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Hubba. This wasn't a raiding party, it was a full-scale invasion force designed to carve up Anglo-Saxon England like a Christmas turkey. Within 5 years, they had systematically dismantled 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria fell first, then East Anglia, then Mercia. Only Wessex, under the future Alfred the Great, managed to hold out. But even then, the Vikings controlled roughly half of England, establishing what became known as the Danelaw, a massive territory where Viking law, customs and settlements became the norm. But here's what's truly mind-blowing about this conquest. The Vikings didn't just take over existing structures. They completely reimagined how territory could be organised and governed. The Danelaw wasn't just occupied England, it was a hybrid society that combined the best of both Viking and Anglo-Saxon traditions. And this pattern repeated itself across Europe. In Ireland, Vikings founded cities like Dublin, Cork and Waterford, urban centres that hadn't existed before their arrival. These weren't just military outposts, they became thriving commercial hubs that connected Ireland to trade networks spanning from Greenland to Constantinople. In France, the situation was even more dramatic. When Viking leader Rollo negotiated the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911, he wasn't just getting permission to raid, he was being granted an entire duchy in exchange for protecting northern France from other Viking attacks. This territory would become Normandy, and Rollo's descendants would go on to conquer England, establish kingdoms in southern Italy and Sicily, and play crucial roles in the Crusades. But perhaps nowhere was the Viking transformation more complete than in what would become Russia. When Swedish Vikings, known as the Varangians, began moving down the river systems of Eastern Europe, they encountered Slavic tribes, Finno-Ugric peoples, and Byzantine trading posts. Instead of simply conquering these populations, they created something entirely new, a unified state structure that would eventually become the foundation of the Russian Empire. The legendary Rurik, invited by Slavic tribes to rule over them around 862, established a dynasty that would last for over 700 years. His successors would go on to capture Kiev, establish trade routes to Constantinople, and create the political framework that Vladimir the Great would use when he converted Russia to Christianity in 988. What's happening here isn't just conquest, it's the birth of new nations, new identities, and new ways of organising European society. The Vikings weren't just redrawing political boundaries, they were fundamentally changing how people thought about kingship, trade, warfare, and cultural identity, and we're just getting started. Because while all this territorial expansion was happening, the Vikings were simultaneously building something even more ambitious, a trade network that spanned from North America to the Middle East, connecting economies and cultures in ways that wouldn't be seen again until the Age of Exploration. This trade network wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. While most of medieval Europe was still operating on a localised village-to-village economy, the Vikings had created what was essentially the world's first global marketplace, and the scale of this operation will absolutely blow your mind. Picture this, a silver coin minted in Baghdad, ending up in a Viking grave in Sweden. Arabic texts describing blonde-haired warriors trading amber and furs in the markets of Constantinople. Walrus ivory, from Greenland being carved into chess pieces and sold in London. This wasn't happening occasionally. This was a systematic, organised trade empire that moved goods, ideas and people across distances that would have been unimaginable to anyone else at the time. But here's where the Vikings showed their true genius. They didn't just move goods along existing trade routes, they created entirely new ones. The famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks connected Scandinavia to Constantinople by way of Russian rivers. Vikings would sail up the Dnieper, portage their ships over land, and continue down different river systems until they reached the Black Sea. They literally turned Eastern Europe into a maritime highway. And this wasn't just about making money, though they certainly did plenty of that. This trade network was the Vikings' secret weapon for political influence. When you control the flow of luxury goods, precious metals, and exotic commodities, you automatically become someone that kings and emperors need to deal with. The Vikings weren't just showing up at royal courts as raiders anymore, they were arriving as essential business partners. Take the relationship between Scandinavian traders and the Islamic world, for instance. We're talking about a period when Christian and Muslim powers were supposed to be mortal enemies. Yet Viking merchants were regularly travelling to Central Asia, trading with Arab merchants, and bringing Islamic silver back to Scandinavia in such quantities that modern archaeologists have found more Arabic coins in Sweden than in some parts of the Middle East. This created something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a people who were culturally neutral enough to trade with everyone. Christians, Muslims, pagans, it didn't matter to the Vikings as long as business was good. This neutrality became a massive strategic advantage because while other European powers were locked into religious and political conflicts that limited their options, the Vikings could play all sides. But the real masterstroke wasn't just the trading itself. It was how the Vikings used their economic power to establish political legitimacy. See, there's a pattern here that repeats across every major Viking settlement. First, they'd arrive as traders or mercenaries. Then, they'd gradually work their way into positions of influence within existing power structures. Finally, they'd leverage that influence to establish their own kingdoms or principalities. Look at what happened in Kiev, for example. The Varangians didn't just conquer the Slavic tribes and impose their rule. They married into local noble families, adopted local customs and languages, and gradually transformed themselves from foreign mercenaries into legitimate rulers. By the time Prince Vladimir was converting Russia to Christianity, his dynasty had been ruling for over a century, and nobody questioned their right to the throne. This pattern was so successful that European rulers started actively recruiting Vikings to serve in their armies and administrations. The Byzantine Empire created an entire military unit, the Varangian Guard, composed exclusively of Norse warriors. These weren't just hired muscle, they became the emperor's personal bodyguards, the most elite military unit in the most powerful empire in the world. And here's what's truly remarkable. Service in the Varangian Guard became a pathway to wealth and status that attracted Vikings from across Scandinavia. Young warriors would travel thousands of miles to Constantinople, serve their time in the imperial army, accumulate wealth and prestige, then return home to establish their own kingdoms or join expeditions to new territories. This created a feedback loop that kept Viking expansion going for centuries. Success in one region would generate resources and experienced leaders for expansion into new areas. The wealth flowing back to Scandinavia would fund bigger expeditions, better equipment, and more ambitious projects. It was like a medieval venture capital system, except instead of funding startups, they were funding invasions. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the Viking expansion strategy was their approach to settlement and assimilation. Unlike other conquerors who tried to maintain distinct ethnic and cultural boundaries, the Vikings developed what we might call cultural shape-shifting. They became masters at adapting to local conditions while maintaining their core advantages in warfare, navigation, and trade. In Normandy, they became French-speaking Christians who retained their military prowess and maritime skills. In Ireland, they founded cities and became urban merchants while maintaining their warrior culture. In Russia, they created a hybrid Slavic-Norse identity that combined the best elements of both traditions. In Iceland, they established what was arguably the world's first parliamentary democracy, the Althing, which functioned as both a court system and a legislative assembly. This flexibility allowed the Vikings to succeed where other expansionist cultures failed. They weren't trying to recreate Scandinavia everywhere they went. They were creating new societies that combined Viking innovations with local strengths. This made their settlements more sustainable, their rule more acceptable to local populations, and their expansion more politically stable. The results speak for themselves. By the year 1000 AD, people of Scandinavian descent ruled kingdoms from Greenland to Russia, from Ireland to Sicily. They had established the first European settlement in North America. They controlled trade routes that connected 3 continents. They had founded cities that would become major European capitals. They had created legal and political institutions that would influence European development for centuries. But here's what's really mind-blowing. They did all of this while maintaining cultural and political connections across vast distances. A Viking king in York could call upon support from relatives in Dublin. A merchant in Novgorod could rely on trading partnerships established in Bergen. A warrior serving in Constantinople could return home to Iceland with enough wealth to establish his own farmstead. This wasn't just conquest. This was the creation of what historians now call the Viking world, an interconnected network of settlements, trade routes, and political relationships that spanned half the globe. And the most remarkable thing about this world was how it managed to maintain coherence despite the enormous distances and cultural differences involved. The secret was what the Vikings called reputation. In a culture where written records were limited and communication was slow, your reputation, your word, your honour, your reliability became your most valuable asset. A Viking whose reputation was damaged in one part of the network would find himself ostracised everywhere else. This created powerful incentives for honesty, reliability, and mutual support that held the entire system together. And this system was incredibly sophisticated. Vikings developed complex legal codes for resolving disputes between people from different regions. They created standardized weights and measures for trade. They established procedures for forming partnerships between people who might never meet face to face. They even developed a form of maritime insurance where multiple investors would share the risks and profits of long-distance trading voyages. What we're looking at here isn't just successful raiding or clever trading, this is the emergence of a truly international civilization, one that operated according to principles that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. The Vikings had essentially created the medieval equivalent of a multinational corporation, except instead of selling products, they were selling military service, political stability, and economic connectivity. And the impact of this Viking network on European development was absolutely transformative. Cities that had been isolated backwaters became major commercial centres. Regions that had been cut off from international trade suddenly found themselves connected to markets spanning 3 continents. Political systems that had been purely local began incorporating international elements and perspectives. But perhaps most importantly, the Viking expansion created something that Europe had never seen before, a truly integrated political and economic system that transcended traditional ethnic, religious, and cultural boundaries. For the first time since the fall of Rome, there was a force capable of thinking and acting on a continental scale. And this continental thinking wasn't just theoretical, it had massive practical consequences that are still shaping Europe today. Because here's what happened when the Vikings started operating on this scale. They didn't just create trade routes and establish kingdoms. They fundamentally changed how Europeans thought about distance, territory, and political possibility. Before the Vikings, most European rulers thought in terms of what they could see from their castle walls. Your kingdom was your immediate territory, your enemies were your neighbours, and your world ended at the horizon. But the Vikings introduced something revolutionary, the concept of distributed power. They showed that you could rule territories thousands of miles apart, maintain loyalty across vast distances, and coordinate military and economic activities on a scale that seemed impossible. This wasn't just impressive, it was terrifying to established powers. Imagine you're a Frankish king dealing with local rebellions and border disputes, and suddenly you're facing an enemy who can coordinate attacks from Ireland, Denmark, and Russia simultaneously. You're not just fighting a local rival anymore, you're facing what amounts to a medieval superpower with resources and reach that dwarfs anything you've ever encountered. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. The Vikings didn't just win battles, they shattered the entire conceptual framework that European rulers used to understand warfare and politics. Traditional defensive strategies became useless when your enemy could appear anywhere along thousands of miles of coastline. Traditional diplomatic solutions failed when you were dealing with leaders who had alternatives and resources that you couldn't even comprehend. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Instead of just using this advantage to conquer and destroy, the Vikings began to offer something that European rulers desperately needed: stability and protection. Remember, this was a period when Europe was fragmented, chaotic, and constantly under threat from multiple directions. Magyar raiders from the east, Saracen pirates from the south, internal rebellions, succession crises. European rulers were drowning in problems they couldn't solve with traditional methods. Enter the Vikings with a proposition that was impossible to refuse. Hire us as your military elite, grant us territory and trading rights, and we'll solve your security problems while opening up economic opportunities you never dreamed of. This wasn't just mercenary work. This was the medieval equivalent of a comprehensive defense and development package, and the results were spectacular. In France, the establishment of Normandy didn't just end Viking raids, it created one of the most powerful and innovative duchies in Europe. The Normans became masters of castle construction, cavalry warfare, and administrative efficiency. They turned northern France from a constantly raided borderland into a launching pad for expeditions that would conquer England, southern Italy, Sicily, and establish Crusader states in the Middle East. In England, the integration of Viking settlers into Anglo-Saxon society created a hybrid culture that was more dynamic and adaptable than either parent civilization. The legal systems, urban development, and trade networks established during the Danelaw period became foundations for England's later emergence as a major European power. In Russia, the Varangian ruling class created political and military institutions that allowed a collection of scattered Slavic tribes to become a unified state, capable of challenging the Byzantine Empire and eventually expanding across the largest landmass in the world. This pattern repeated itself everywhere the Vikings established lasting settlements. They didn't just take over existing structures, they upgraded them. They brought technological innovations, organizational methods, and strategic thinking that transformed local societies into regional powers. But the real genius of the Viking system was how it created positive feedback loops between different regions. Success in one area would generate resources and knowledge that could be applied elsewhere. Military innovations developed in Ireland would be refined in England and then applied in Russia. Trading techniques perfected in the Baltic would be adapted for Mediterranean markets. Administrative solutions worked out in Iceland would be implemented in Normandy. This cross-pollination of ideas and methods meant that Viking settlements were constantly evolving and improving. They weren't static conquests that gradually declined over time. They were dynamic societies that kept getting stronger and more sophisticated as they learned from each other. And here's what's truly remarkable. This system was so effective that it began to transform non-Viking societies as well. European rulers started adopting Viking military tactics, administrative methods, and trading practices. Cities across Europe began modelling themselves on Viking trading centres. Legal systems incorporated Viking concepts of individual rights and democratic decision-making. The Vikings weren't just conquering Europe, they were teaching Europe how to be more successful. And European societies that were quick to adopt Viking innovations found themselves with massive advantages over those that tried to maintain traditional methods. Take maritime technology, for instance. Viking shipbuilding techniques were so superior that within a century, every major European naval power was building vessels based on Scandinavian designs. The shallow draft, flexible construction that made Viking longships so effective became the foundation for all subsequent developments in European naval architecture. Or consider urban planning. Viking trading centres like Dublin, York and Novgorod weren't just random collections of buildings. They were carefully designed commercial and administrative hubs that maximised efficiency and defensibility. European cities that adopted Viking urban planning principles became more prosperous and powerful than those that stuck with traditional layouts. But perhaps most importantly, the Vikings introduced a completely new approach to international relations. Instead of the traditional European model where kingdoms were in constant conflict with their neighbours, the Vikings demonstrated the advantages of what we might call cooperative competition. Viking settlements would compete with each other economically and politically, but they would also support each other against external threats and share resources during crises. This created a level of international stability and cooperation that Europe hadn't seen since the height of the Roman Empire. Trade flourished because merchants could rely on protection and fair treatment across vast networks of Viking settlements. Cultural exchange accelerated because people could travel safely between regions that had previously been isolated from each other. Technological and social innovations spread rapidly because successful developments in one area would quickly be adopted elsewhere. The cumulative effect of all these changes was staggering. By the 11th century, Europe had been completely transformed. The continent that the Vikings had encountered in the 8th century, fragmented, isolated, and technologically backward, had become an interconnected network of powerful kingdoms with global reach and ambitions. And this transformation wasn't temporary. The political boundaries, trade routes, legal systems, and cultural institutions established during the Viking Age became the foundations for everything that followed. The Norman conquest of England, the Crusades, the rise of powerful medieval kingdoms, the development of international commerce, all of these developments built on frameworks that the Vikings had established centuries earlier. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. The Vikings accomplished all of this while representing a tiny fraction of Europe's total population. We're talking about maybe 500,000 Scandinavians reshaping a continent of tens of millions of people. They did it not through overwhelming numbers or superior resources, but through superior organization, strategy, and adaptability. This raises a fascinating question. How did such a small population manage to have such an enormous impact? The answer lies in understanding something that most people miss about Viking society. They weren't just warriors or traders or explorers. They were systems thinkers who understood how to leverage small advantages into massive results. Every aspect of Viking expansion was designed to maximize efficiency and minimize waste. Their longships weren't just fast, they were also easy to build, maintain, and repair using materials available almost anywhere. Their military tactics weren't just effective, they were also flexible enough to adapt to any terrain or enemy. Their trading networks weren't just profitable, they were also structured to provide multiple backup options if any single route was disrupted. This systematic approach to problem solving allowed the Vikings to punch far above their weight in every situation they encountered. A small Viking force could defeat much larger armies because they had better coordination, equipment, and tactics. A Viking trading expedition could outcompete established merchants because they had access to goods, routes, and financing that others couldn't match. And perhaps most importantly, Viking leaders understood something that their contemporaries didn't: the power of reputation and relationships. In a world where communication was slow and uncertain, being known as reliable, competent, and trustworthy was worth more than gold. Vikings invested enormous effort in building and maintaining their reputations because they understood that reputation was the foundation of all other forms of power. This focus on reputation created a culture of excellence that permeated every aspect of Viking society. Whether you were a warrior, trader, craftsman, or leader, your success depended on your ability to consistently deliver results that exceeded expectations. This created powerful incentives for innovation, skill development, and collaborative problem solving that made Viking communities incredibly dynamic and adaptive. The result was a civilization that was constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Vikings were the first Europeans to reach North America, not because they were lucky, but because they had developed the navigational skills, shipbuilding technology, and organizational capabilities necessary for transoceanic exploration. They established the first stable democratic institutions in medieval Europe, not by accident, but because they had figured out how to balance individual freedom with collective decision-making. They created the most extensive trade networks of the medieval period, not through force alone, but because they had developed systems for managing complex international relationships across vast distances and cultural differences. They established some of the most successful and long-lasting kingdoms in European history, not through conquest alone, but because they had learned how to build political institutions that could adapt and evolve over time. And all of this was accomplished while maintaining cultural coherence and shared identity across distances and time spans that would challenge even modern nation-states. A Viking in Greenland in 1100 AD would still recognise and identify with Vikings in Sicily or Russia, despite centuries of separate development and thousands of miles of separation. This combination of local adaptation and cultural continuity was perhaps the Vikings' greatest achievement. They proved that it was possible to create a truly international civilization without sacrificing the local knowledge and relationships that made communities successful. They showed that cultural identity could be both stable and flexible, both rooted in tradition and open to innovation. But as we'll see, this remarkable Viking world was about to face its greatest test, because by the 12th century, the very success of Viking expansion had created new challenges and opportunities that would push their system to its absolute limits. The Europe they had helped create was becoming powerful enough to challenge Viking dominance, while new technologies and social developments were changing the rules of the game entirely. The question was whether the Viking system that had proven so adaptable and resilient for 3 centuries could evolve quickly enough to meet these new challenges. The answer would determine not just the fate of Viking civilization, but the future direction of European development itself. The answer came in the form of something that would test every principle the Vikings had developed over 3 centuries of expansion, because while they had been busy transforming Europe, Europe had been learning from them, and by the 12th century, the student was about to become the teacher. Here's what was happening. The very kingdoms that Vikings had helped establish were now becoming powerful enough to challenge Viking supremacy. England, under the Norman kings, themselves descendants of Vikings, had developed into a centralised monarchy with resources that dwarfed any individual Viking kingdom. France was consolidating under the Capetian dynasty. The Holy Roman Empire was asserting control over previously independent territories. Even Russia, founded by Viking princes, was becoming a unified state that no longer needed Scandinavian military leadership. But here's where the Vikings showed their true genius. One more time, instead of trying to fight this tide of consolidation, they adapted to it. They realised that the age of small-scale raiding and settlement was coming to an end, but the age of large-scale political influence was just beginning. Take what happened with the Norman conquest of England in 1066. This wasn't just William the Conqueror deciding to invade his neighbour. This was the culmination of centuries of Viking political strategy reaching its ultimate expression. William wasn't just a Norman duke, he was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, the Viking leader who had negotiated the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. His claim to the English throne was based on family connections that stretched back to Viking settlements in both Normandy and England. And when William invaded England, he wasn't just bringing Norman knights. His army included Vikings from across Scandinavia, Norman French warriors descended from Viking settlers, and even mercenaries from Viking communities in Ireland and Scotland. This was the Viking network operating at maximum efficiency, coordinating resources from across Europe for a single, decisive campaign. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just a Norman victory, it was a Viking victory achieved through 3 centuries of patient political manoeuvring. And the consequences were staggering. Overnight, England went from being a peripheral European kingdom to being the centre of an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But here's what's truly mind-blowing about this transformation. William and his successors didn't try to impose Norman culture on England. Instead, they did what Vikings had always done. They adapted local institutions while maintaining their core advantages. They kept Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, but added Norman administrative efficiency. They preserved English religious practices, but introduced continental political concepts. They maintained local languages and customs, but created new forms of cultural expression that combined the best of both traditions. The result was something entirely new, a hybrid Anglo-Norman civilization that was more dynamic and powerful than either of its parent cultures. Within a century, this hybrid society would be launching crusades, establishing universities, developing new forms of literature and art, and creating legal and political institutions that would influence the entire world. And this pattern was repeating itself everywhere. Former Viking territories were consolidating into larger kingdoms. In Sicily, Norman knights descended from Viking settlers were creating one of the most sophisticated and tolerant kingdoms in medieval Europe, a place where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked together to translate ancient texts and develop new forms of knowledge. In Russia, the descendants of Varangian princes were building a state that would eventually stretch from the Baltic to the Pacific, incorporating dozens of different ethnic groups and cultural traditions into a unified political system that combined Byzantine administrative methods with Viking military traditions and Slavic social customs. In Ireland, Viking-founded cities like Dublin were becoming the centres of a cultural renaissance that would produce some of the most beautiful, illuminated manuscripts and sophisticated legal codes in medieval Europe. Even in Scandinavia itself, the success of Viking expansion was transforming the homeland. The wealth flowing back from overseas territories was funding the construction of magnificent churches, the development of new agricultural techniques, and the establishment of royal courts that could rival anything in continental Europe. But perhaps most importantly, the Viking expansion had created something that had never existed before, a truly European identity. For the first time since the fall of Rome, people across the continent were connected by shared institutions, common legal principles, and mutual economic interests that transcended traditional ethnic and religious boundaries. A merchant in London could do business with a trader in Kiev using legal procedures that both understood. A knight in Sicily could communicate with a warrior in Sweden using cultural concepts that both recognised. A scholar in Dublin could correspond with a philosopher in Constantinople about ideas that both found meaningful. This wasn't just political unification, this was the birth of European civilization as we know it. And it happened because the Vikings had spent 3 centuries teaching Europe how to think beyond traditional boundaries, how to adapt to new circumstances, and how to build institutions that could function across vast distances and cultural differences. Now you might be wondering, if the Vikings were so successful, why did their distinct identity eventually disappear? Why aren't there Viking kingdoms still ruling parts of Europe today? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of successful civilizations. The Vikings succeeded so completely that they made themselves obsolete. They had taught Europe how to organize itself so effectively that distinct Viking identity was no longer necessary. The hybrid societies they had created were now capable of generating their own innovations, solving their own problems, and expanding into new territories without Scandinavian leadership. This wasn't failure, this was the ultimate success. The Vikings had achieved something that no other expansionist civilization in history had managed. They had created a system that could function and evolve without them. Instead of building an empire that would collapse when the center weakened, they had created a network of interconnected societies that became stronger and more sophisticated over time. By the 13th century, the descendants of Viking settlers were leading the Crusades, establishing universities, developing new forms of art and literature, creating legal systems that would influence the entire world, and exploring new territories from Greenland to the Mediterranean. They were doing all of this not as Vikings, but as English, French, Norman, Russian, Irish and Sicilian leaders who had inherited Viking organizational methods and strategic thinking. The genetic and cultural legacy of the Vikings had become so thoroughly integrated into European society that it was impossible to separate Viking contributions from European development in general. The political boundaries they had established became the foundations for modern nation-states. The trade routes they had pioneered became the basis for international commerce. The legal principles they had developed became cornerstones of Western civilization. But here's what's truly remarkable about this transformation. It happened without losing the core Viking values that had made the expansion possible in the first place. The emphasis on individual achievement, democratic decision-making, international trade, cultural adaptation, and strategic thinking became permanent features of European civilization. Even today, if you look at the most successful societies in the world, you'll find that they share characteristics that the Vikings pioneered over 1,000 years ago. They're open to international trade and cultural exchange. They have strong democratic institutions. They value individual initiative and achievement. They're willing to adapt their traditions to meet new challenges, and they think strategically about long-term development rather than just short-term advantage. The Scandinavian countries that were the original Viking homeland are now consistently ranked among the most prosperous, democratic, and socially advanced societies in the world. The countries that experienced the most intensive Viking settlement, England, Ireland, France, Russia, became the major powers that shaped global development for centuries. But perhaps most tellingly, the regions where Viking influence was strongest became the launching pads for the next great phase of European expansion, the Age of Exploration. When Europeans began exploring and colonizing the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they were using organizational methods, navigational techniques, and strategic approaches that had been pioneered by the Vikings centuries earlier. The Spanish conquistadors who conquered the Aztec and Inca empires were using tactics that the Vikings had developed for dealing with technologically different societies. The Portuguese navigators who opened trade routes to Asia were following principles of maritime exploration that Viking sea captains had established. The English colonists who settled North America were building societies based on legal and political concepts that had been refined in Viking settlements from Iceland to Russia. In a very real sense, European global expansion was the final chapter of the Viking story. The organizational methods, strategic thinking, and cultural adaptability that had allowed a few 100,000 Scandinavians to reshape medieval Europe were now being applied on a global scale by their cultural descendants. This raises a fascinating question that historians are still debating. Would the Age of Exploration have happened without the Viking precedent? Would Europeans have developed the organizational capabilities, strategic thinking, and cultural confidence necessary for global expansion if the Vikings hadn't spent 3 centuries demonstrating that small populations could successfully establish themselves in distant territories? We can't know for certain, but what we do know is that the European societies that were most successful during the Age of Exploration were precisely those that had been most thoroughly influenced by Viking settlement and organisation. England, which became the dominant global power of the early modern period, was a hybrid Anglo-Norman society that had been shaped by centuries of Viking influence. Spain, which pioneered European expansion into the Americas, had been influenced by Norman knights, who brought Viking organisational methods to the Iberian Peninsula. Even the technologies that made global exploration possible, improved ship design, navigational techniques, cartographic methods, were direct descendants of innovations that the Vikings had pioneered during their expansion across medieval Europe. So when we talk about how the Vikings redrew Europe's map, we're not just talking about political boundaries or trade routes. We're talking about a fundamental transformation in how Europeans thought about distance, territory, cultural difference, and political possibility. The Vikings didn't just conquer territory, they conquered the European imagination and opened up possibilities that shaped the entire course of world history. And here's the most incredible part. They did it all with a population that never exceeded a few 100,000 people, using technologies that were barely more advanced than what their neighbours possessed, in a period when communication was slow and uncertain. They succeeded through superior organisation, strategic thinking, and cultural adaptability, qualities that any society can develop if it's willing to embrace change and think beyond traditional limitations. The Viking story isn't just about medieval Scandinavians. It's about what becomes possible when a society commits to excellence, embraces innovation, and thinks systematically about long-term development. It's about how small populations can have enormous impact if they're willing to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their core strengths. Most importantly, it's about how successful civilizations don't just conquer territory. They transform the very concepts that other societies use to understand what's possible. The Vikings didn't just redraw Europe's political map. They redrew the mental map that Europeans used to navigate their world. And that mental transformation proved to be far more important than any single battle, treaty, or territorial conquest. Because once Europeans learned to think like Vikings, strategically, internationally, adaptively, there was no limit to what they could accomplish. The dragon ships that appeared off Lindisfarne in 793 weren't just bringing raiders to a quiet monastery. They were bringing a new way of thinking about the world that would ultimately reshape human civilization itself. And that transformation is still ongoing today, as societies around the world continue to grapple with the same challenges that the Vikings mastered over 1,000 years ago. How to maintain cultural identity while adapting to change. How to build sustainable institutions across vast distances. And how to turn diversity into strength rather than weakness. The Vikings solved these problems so thoroughly that their solutions became the foundation for everything that followed. And understanding how they did it might just hold the key to solving the challenges we face today. Now here's where the Viking story takes a turn that will completely shatter everything you think you know about medieval warfare and politics. Because while most historians focus on the obvious stuff, the raids, the battles, the territorial conquests, they're missing the real revolution that was happening behind the scenes. The Vikings weren't just building kingdoms, they were inventing an entirely new form of power that would make traditional medieval authority look like a children's game. See, every other European ruler at this time was trapped in what we might call the castle mindset. Your power came from the land you directly controlled, the peasants who worked that land, and the knights who owed you military service. If you wanted to expand, you had to physically conquer adjacent territory, and then somehow hold it against neighbours who wanted it back. It was a zero-sum game, where every gain required enormous resources and created new enemies. But the Vikings had discovered something revolutionary: network power. Instead of trying to control territory directly, they created webs of relationships, alliances, and economic dependencies that gave them influence far beyond what their actual military strength should have allowed. A Viking leader might have formal authority over just one small settlement, but through family connections, trading partnerships, and military alliances, he could coordinate activities across half of Europe. Take Olaf Tryggvason, for instance. On paper, he was just the king of Norway from 995 to 1000 AD, but through his network of relationships, he was simultaneously influencing politics in Iceland, Ireland, England, and Denmark. He had trading partnerships that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. He could call upon military support from dozens of different communities scattered across thousands of miles. When he decided to convert Norway to Christianity, he wasn't just making a religious decision for one kingdom. He was reshaping the cultural landscape of the entire North Atlantic. And here's what's truly mind-blowing about this system. It was almost impossible for traditional powers to counter. How do you fight an enemy who doesn't have a single capital city you can capture? How do you negotiate with a leader whose power comes from relationships rather than territory? How do you predict the moves of someone who has options and allies that you can't even identify? This network approach gave the Vikings what military strategists today would call asymmetric advantage. They could bring overwhelming force to bear at specific points while maintaining flexibility everywhere else. They could absorb losses in one region by shifting resources from others. Most importantly, they could learn from experiences in one area and immediately apply those lessons across their entire network. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Vikings didn't just use this network for military and political purposes. They turned it into the world's first intelligence system. Remember, this was a period when most rulers were operating blind. Communication was slow, information was unreliable, and you often didn't know what was happening in the next valley, let alone the next kingdom. The Vikings solved this problem by turning every trader, raider, and settler into an intelligence gatherer. A merchant ship returning from Constantinople would bring not just goods, but detailed information about Byzantine military preparations, political developments, and economic conditions. A raiding party hitting the Irish coast would return with intelligence about English naval movements, Frankish diplomatic initiatives, and local political conflicts. This information was then shared across the entire network through a system that was incredibly sophisticated for its time. Viking leaders maintained what were essentially diplomatic correspondence networks that allowed them to coordinate activities and share intelligence across vast distances. They developed standardized systems for evaluating and transmitting information. They even created specialized roles for people whose primary job was to travel between different Viking communities, maintaining relationships and sharing knowledge. The result was that Viking leaders often knew more about what was happening in foreign courts than those courts knew about each other. They could predict political developments, anticipate military movements, and identify opportunities before anyone else even realized they existed. This intelligence advantage was often more valuable than military superiority because it allowed them to be in the right place at the right time with exactly the right resources and allies. And they didn't just gather intelligence passively. They actively shaped the information environment to their advantage. Vikings became masters of what we would now call information warfare. They would spread rumours designed to destabilise enemy alliances, plant false information to misdirect enemy movements, and use their reputation for ferocity to intimidate opponents without actually having to fight. The famous berserker warriors, for instance, weren't just elite fighters. They were psychological weapons designed to create terror and confusion in enemy ranks. The very idea that Vikings might be sailing toward your coast was often enough to cause panic, even if no actual Viking ships were anywhere in the area. This psychological advantage allowed relatively small Viking forces to achieve results that would have required much larger conventional armies. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the Viking information system was how they used it to create what economists today would call market intelligence. Viking traders weren't just buying and selling goods, they were gathering detailed information about supply and demand, price fluctuations, and economic opportunities across multiple continents. This allowed them to engage in what was essentially medieval arbitrage trading. They would buy goods where they were abundant and cheap, transport them to regions where they were scarce and valuable, and sell them at enormous profits. But more than that, they could predict market developments and position themselves to take advantage of economic changes before their competitors even knew what was happening. When political instability in one region disrupted traditional trade routes, Vikings would already have alternative routes mapped out. When new sources of valuable goods became available, Vikings would be among the first to establish trading relationships. When economic demand shifted in response to cultural or technological changes, Vikings would already be positioned to meet that demand. This combination of military flexibility, political networking, intelligence gathering, and economic sophistication created a form of power that was completely unprecedented in medieval Europe. The Vikings weren't just another barbarian tribe that got lucky with a few successful raids. They were operating according to principles that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of modern international corporations. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. They developed these capabilities organically, through trial and error, without any of the institutional support systems that modern organizations take for granted. They didn't have universities to train their leaders, bureaucracies to manage their operations, or legal systems to enforce their agreements. Everything had to be built from scratch using nothing but personal relationships, cultural traditions, and practical experience. The fact that this system worked so well for so long is a testament to something fundamental about Viking culture that most people completely miss. These weren't just tough guys with boats, they were incredibly sophisticated thinkers who understood complex systems, long-term strategy, and international relations better than most of their supposedly more civilized contemporaries. Take their approach to religion, for example. Most medieval societies were locked into rigid religious identities that limited their diplomatic and economic options. Christians couldn't easily deal with Muslims, pagans were excluded from Christian kingdoms, and religious differences often made cooperation impossible, even when it would have been mutually beneficial. The Vikings solved this problem through what we might call strategic religious flexibility. They maintained their traditional Norse religious practices when it was advantageous, but they were also willing to convert to Christianity or adopt local religious customs when it served their purposes. This wasn't cynical opportunism, it was sophisticated cultural intelligence that allowed them to build relationships across religious boundaries that other societies couldn't cross. A Viking leader might be baptized as a Christian to secure an alliance with a Frankish king, participate in traditional Norse rituals to maintain the loyalty of his Scandinavian followers, and show respect for local religious customs to gain acceptance in Irish or Slavic communities. This flexibility allowed Vikings to operate in cultural environments that would have been completely closed to more rigid societies. But they didn't just adapt to existing religious frameworks. They actively synthesized different traditions to create new forms of cultural expression that combined the best elements of multiple systems. The Christianity that developed in Viking-influenced regions was different from what you found elsewhere in Europe. It incorporated Norse concepts of individual honor, democratic decision-making, and military valor in ways that created distinctive, regional variations of Christian culture. This synthetic approach extended to every aspect of Viking society. Their legal systems combined Norse traditions with local customs and Roman legal concepts. Their military tactics incorporated elements learned from fighting Byzantines, Arabs, Slavs, and Celts. Their artistic styles fused Scandinavian motifs with influences absorbed from across their trading networks. The result was a civilization that was constantly evolving and improving, absorbing new ideas and techniques from every culture it encountered, while maintaining a coherent core identity that could adapt to any environment. This made Viking societies incredibly resilient and dynamic compared to more static medieval cultures that tried to maintain rigid traditional forms. And this adaptability wasn't just a survival mechanism, it was a competitive advantage that allowed Vikings to consistently outperform their rivals in every field of activity. Viking merchants could operate in more markets because they understood more cultural contexts. Viking warriors could fight effectively in more environments because they had learned from more military traditions. Viking leaders could build more diverse coalitions because they could communicate across more cultural boundaries. But here's what's truly extraordinary about this system. It created positive feedback loops. that made the entire Viking network stronger over time. Every successful adaptation in one region would be communicated to other Viking communities, where it would be tested, refined, and adapted to local conditions. Innovations developed in Iceland would be applied in Russia, techniques perfected in Ireland would be used in Normandy, and strategies worked out in England would be implemented in Sicily. This meant that Viking civilization wasn't just expanding geographically, it was evolving intellectually and culturally at a pace that far exceeded anything else in medieval Europe. While other societies were struggling to maintain traditional practices in the face of changing circumstances, Viking communities were actively seeking out new challenges and opportunities that would force them to develop new capabilities. The cumulative effect of this evolutionary process was staggering. By the 11th century, Viking-influenced societies were leading Europe in virtually every field of human activity. They had the most advanced military technologies, the most sophisticated trading networks, the most effective governmental systems, and the most dynamic cultural institutions. But perhaps most importantly, they had developed something that would prove to be their most lasting contribution to European civilization: a systematic approach to innovation and adaptation that could be applied to any challenge or opportunity. This wasn't just a collection of techniques or practices, it was a way of thinking about problems that emphasized flexibility, experimentation, and continuous improvement. This mindset became embedded in the institutions and cultures that Vikings established, and it continued to drive innovation and development long after distinct Viking identity had disappeared. The universities that were founded in Viking-influenced regions became centers of intellectual innovation. The kingdoms that were established by Viking leaders became pioneers in governmental reform. The cities that were founded as Viking trading centers became hubs of technological and cultural development. Even today, if you look at the regions of Europe that were most heavily influenced by Viking settlement, you'll find that they tend to be among the most innovative, adaptable, and successful societies in the world. This isn't coincidence. It's the long-term result of cultural patterns and institutional frameworks that were established over 1,000 years ago. The Vikings didn't just redraw Europe's political map. They rewrote the cultural DNA that would determine how European societies would respond to challenges and opportunities for centuries to come. And that cultural transformation may have been their greatest achievement of all. But as we're about to see, this remarkable system of innovation and adaptation was about to face its ultimate test. Because by the 12th century, the very success of Viking expansion had created a new set of challenges that would push their adaptive capabilities to the absolute limit. The question was whether the principles that had served them so well for 3 centuries could evolve quickly enough to meet threats and opportunities that were unlike anything they had ever encountered before. The answer would determine not just the fate of Viking civilization, but the future direction of world history itself. And what happened next would prove that the Vikings had created something even more remarkable than anyone had imagined, a system of thinking and organization that could transcend its original cultural context and become a permanent part of human civilization. Because here's what was happening as we moved into the High Middle Ages. The very societies that Vikings had helped create were now becoming sophisticated enough to challenge Viking dominance using Viking methods. It was like watching your students graduate and then having to compete with them using the techniques you had taught them. The Norman kingdoms that descended from Viking settlements had mastered the art of combining military innovation with administrative efficiency. The English monarchy had learned how to project power across vast distances while maintaining local legitimacy. The Russian principalities had figured out how to integrate diverse populations into unified political systems. Even the Crusader states in the Middle East were applying Viking organizational principles to the challenges of governing conquered territories. This created a fascinating paradox. The more successful the Vikings became at teaching other societies their methods, the less unique their advantages became. The network effects, intelligence systems, and adaptive strategies that had given them such overwhelming superiority were now being used by everyone else. But here's where the real genius of Viking civilization revealed itself. Instead of trying to maintain their advantages through secrecy or exclusion, they had built their entire system on principles of openness and adaptation. This meant that when other societies began to master Viking techniques, the Vikings themselves were already moving on to the next level of innovation. The 12th and 13th centuries saw Viking-influenced societies pioneering developments that would reshape the entire world. The rise of universities and systematic education, the development of sophisticated banking and credit systems, the emergence of representative government and constitutional law, the beginning of systematic scientific investigation, and the first attempts at global exploration and trade. These weren't just incremental improvements on existing practices, they were fundamental breakthroughs that opened up entirely new possibilities for human organization and achievement. And they happened precisely because Viking culture had created institutional frameworks that could support continuous innovation and adaptation. The universities that emerged in places like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna weren't just schools. They were systematic attempts to create and transmit new forms of knowledge using organizational methods that had been pioneered in Viking assemblies and trading networks. The banking systems that developed in Italian city-states were applications of credit and partnership arrangements that Vikings had used to finance long-distance trading expeditions. The parliamentary institutions that emerged in England and other Viking-influenced regions were adaptations of decision-making processes that had been refined in Icelandic assemblies and Norwegian kings' councils. Even the age of exploration that would eventually connect all the world's continents was built on navigational techniques, organizational methods, and cultural frameworks that could be traced directly back to Viking innovations. When Columbus sailed west to reach the Indies, he was following routes that had been pioneered by Vikings 5 centuries earlier. When Da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope to reach Asia, he was using navigational methods that descended from techniques developed by Viking sea captains. The conquistadors who conquered the Aztec and Inca empires were applying strategies for dealing with technologically different societies that had been worked out during Viking expansion into Ireland, England, and Russia. The trading companies that established European footholds in Asia and Africa were using organizational structures that evolved from Viking merchant partnerships and trading networks. In other words, the age of exploration wasn't a rejection of medieval European traditions. It was the ultimate expression of innovations that had been pioneered during the Viking Age. The same principles of adaptive flexibility, network organization, and systematic innovation that had allowed a few 100,000 Scandinavians to reshape medieval Europe were now being applied on a global scale. This suggests something profound about the nature of successful civilizations. The greatest achievements aren't necessarily the most visible ones. The Vikings are remembered for their raids and conquests, but their real contribution to human development was creating organizational and cultural frameworks that could support continuous innovation across multiple generations. These frameworks proved to be so robust and adaptable that they continue to drive European development long after anyone remembered their Viking origins. The societies that inherited Viking organizational methods became the launching pads for developments that would ultimately reshape the entire world. And this pattern continues today. The most successful modern societies are those that have mastered the same principles that made Viking expansion so effective: openness to innovation, flexibility in adapting to changing circumstances, systematic approaches to problem solving, and the ability to build networks of cooperation across cultural and geographic boundaries. The Scandinavian countries that were the original Viking homeland are now consistently ranked among the most prosperous, democratic, and innovative societies in the world. The regions that experienced the most intensive Viking settlement, Britain, Ireland, northern France, parts of Russia, became the centres of European and global development for centuries. But perhaps most tellingly, the challenges that modern societies face, globalisation, cultural diversity, technological change, environmental adaptation, are essentially the same challenges that the Vikings mastered over 1,000 years ago. The solutions they developed, network organisation, cultural synthesis, systematic innovation, adaptive flexibility, are still the most effective approaches available. This raises a fascinating possibility that the Viking expansion wasn't just a historical episode, but a preview of the kind of organisational capabilities that any society needs to develop if it wants to succeed in a complex, interconnected world. The Vikings succeeded because they figured out how to turn diversity into strength, how to maintain coherence across vast distances, and how to adapt continuously without losing their essential identity. These are exactly the capabilities that modern societies need to navigate an increasingly complex global environment. And the fact that the Vikings developed these capabilities using nothing but personal relationships, cultural traditions, and practical experience suggests that they represent fundamental principles of human organisation rather than just historical accidents. The dragon ships that appeared off Lindisfarne in 793 weren't just bringing raiders to attack a monastery, they were bringing a new model of human civilization that would ultimately prove more influential than any empire or kingdom in human history. Because while empires rise and fall, organisational principles that work tend to become permanent parts of human culture. The Vikings didn't just redraw Europe's map, they redrew the blueprint for how human societies could organise themselves to achieve extraordinary results. And that blueprint is still being used today by anyone who wants to turn ambitious dreams into world-changing realities. The question isn't whether we can learn from the Vikings, we already have. The question is whether we're ready to apply their principles as systematically and creatively as they did. Because if we are, there's no limit to what we might accomplish. But that's a story for another time. Right now, we need to understand how the medieval world that the Vikings created set the stage for everything that would follow. Because the transformation we've been tracking was far from over. It was just getting started.